Alrighty, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Subscribing to My Podcast. Because I have a new guest on the show every week, it's very difficult to get consistent viewership. So if there's one thing that you can do to support me and the guest featured on my show is by interacting with the video. You can always unsubscribe later if you hate me or the content. Without further ado, here's your episode with Professor Gregory Robson is a professor here at Iowa State teaching philosophy with a specialization and interests in religion, political philosophy, the good life, and recently business ethics and technology, and kind of how those intertwine with work life and just life in general. But I reached out to him over email and thankfully he was able to respond. And so we're going to be doing a Zoom call today for the first time, which is really exciting. And this is a good gateway into interviewing people that aren't from Iowa State or are from Iowa State, but currently away. And so this is a good gateway to getting people from all around the world. But Professor, I would love for you to introduce yourself and tell the audience maybe some of the important things that they know about you in case that I missed anything in that introduction.
Well, thank you, Elijah. Thanks for having me on. It's a real pleasure to be with everyone today. Looking forward to our conversation. So I'm a philosopher by training, but I have some background in economics and business, interest in technology studies, and really I've broken a lot of the rules. So the rules are in academia largely that the thing to do is to specialize, to have a very narrow focus, to really dive in deeply into one particular area. And to some extent, I've done that, but I can't help but be interested in a number of topics. So happy to discuss any of the things that you've mentioned. I'm joining you from South Bend, Indiana. I'm visiting faculty at Notre Dam now, and I'll be there starting next year. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, that's really exciting. I want to get to know your journey towards philosophy in general. Like, how did it start? Where did you start in your academic journey? How did you kind of specialize into knowing that you wanted to do philosophy? And just kind of walk me through your journey to where you are today.
So in college, I was in economics, and Vanderbilt called it a human and organizational development double major. So basically economics and business. And I was taking these courses, really interested in a number of different things in business and psychology and in the economic way of thinking. And then sure enough, senior year, my second semester, I took a course on the history of economic thought. And I thought it was really interesting. It actually sounded a little boring to me, but it was in fact very interesting. It was really, of course, an intellectual history. And we were reading people like, Adam Smith, we were reading Marx, F.A. Hayek, the Nobel laureate, who's done so much in the field of political economy, and a number of other thinkers. And then it occurred to me that really we were reading philosophers. So I kept that in mind. Had a somewhat of a long journey, but I was interested in philosophy. I went on to study political science and some law, and figured that what I should do really is follow my heart and pursue the ideas and the interests that I had. And philosophy really kept coming back. And at some point, I became very interested in, kind of looking beyond, as it were, the world of the directly and indirectly observable entities. So we look out in the world, we see various things, we describe them often with mathematics and science, but there might well be a world beyond that. There's not a good reason, I think, to assume that what we know is necessarily apt to describe the world as it is. So that itself is a philosophical consideration, and I went on to study philosophy and eventually made it to Iowa State University, where I had a really, really good experience. It's been really great, and I've really enjoyed working with the students at Iowa State as well as my colleagues.
Yeah, so, you mentioned kind of the interest in things that are beyond our immediate understanding and things that might exist outside of this realm. For people that aren't as interested in philosophy, are there certain aspects of the study that really brought you in? Like, if you were to describe what it is about learning philosophy or what it is about studying philosophy that really engages you or interests you, what would you say some of those aspects of philosophy are?
Well, look, we're all interested in the meaning or meanings of life, right? We want to know what we're doing here. You might think of the obituary test and think, okay, if you were to write your obituary right now, not to get too morbid early in the morning here or mid-morning, but
it's a philosophy discussion. It always happens.
Yeah, that's fair. So if you were to write your obituary, what would be some things you'd be proud of? What would be the things that would be on there that would be on the obituary that would be things you found especially interesting and important about your life, contributions you've made, and so on. So one thing philosophy talks about is the meaning of life. Okay, so philosophy, you can think of it as a really the pursuit of wisdom. So in that sense, it's an approach to life and a method. But it's also a study of reality at the most general level. So I found that very interesting. So for example, if a physicist claims, as many, certainly not all, but many do, that really what we have is a universe governed by the four fundamental forces, say, of physics, and then we're kind of awash in a sea of atoms and quarks and leptons and so on. And all that exists is physical. In fact, all that exists, you might think, is basically a set of atoms governed by these forces, maybe. Well, that's a philosophical claim. That's a claim not in physics, but in metaphysics. And so I became interested in really trying to understand, to the extent, in the small ways that I could, the nature of reality insofar as I could. And I focus on societies and ethics, but I do have an interest, as you can tell, in metaphysics as well. So philosophy for me is exciting as an area of the pursuit of wisdom, of understanding reality very generally, of thinking about questions like, what do we know? How do we know it? What actually exists? How do the things that exist relate to one another? What's the meaning of life? Are we free as human beings in a meaningful way to act? Are we simply governed by the forces of as described in physics? And so on and so forth. So all of those things really, really drew me in, and they draw in many students.
Yeah, and I think those are some of my favorite aspects of learning about these things. I think when I talk to people in the abstract about philosophy, one of the questions that I think I find myself asking all people who study philosophy is, what are some of like the philosophical ideas that you've learned or studied that have really influenced the way that you live life? Like, have you found any answers in this that kind of change how you live, or any prescriptions on how other people might or other people should live? Like, what are like the actual applications of philosophy that you have found useful in your studies?
Yeah, great question. So, for one thing, philosophy really trains students to think well, to write clearly, to develop arguments and counter arguments, to probe different considerations critically. So that's just is a methodological matter. It's a great training in the method of thinking and writing well. Um, Also, it has applications in a number of different areas. So as you mentioned, I do work in business ethics and in technology ethics. There are also fields that are within or overlap with philosophy, such as medical ethics, bioethics. If you think of ethics as really the study of the life well lived, which is a broad definition, but one held basically by Aristotle, a number of ancient Greek philosophers, and many philosophers from then till today, then you'll think that basically in any human activity, we want to understand whether that activity is oriented towards the good, whether it can be better oriented towards the good, whether it is good or bad, right or wrong, whether it violates rights, whether the people involved are doing their duties, and on and on. So, oddly enough, to many ears, philosophy is deeply practical. It's a way of thinking and writing and thinking about how to live.
Yeah, I think this is really good. I think it's difficult sometimes when people hear about philosophy, they think of these really abstract ideas, or they think of these really complex word games that people will play to express ideas that should be relatively simple. But I'd imagine in a lot of the areas that you specialize in, with business and the good life and technology and even religion too, that a lot of your philosophical practices are really applicable to just daily life. Like, they can kind of be boiled down to a prescription of, you should probably do this, you probably shouldn't do this, or these things are good and these things are bad if you want to pursue them. And I think that business ethics is a really interesting way of pursuing this and perceiving this. So if you could lay the groundwork for what is the general conversation around business ethics, and then what are your interests within business ethics? Kind of walk me through that.
Business ethics is a very important field, partly because so much of human life really is affected by business. So in the US, for example, you have over 30 million firms if you include sole proprietorship. So everything from uh, street corner flower stands to, say, Walmart, which has over 2 million employees. So business deeply affects the quality of life that we have. Many think of the sort of the spheres of society as involving business, government, and civil society. Within business ethics, there's a big discussion, a major discussion on the role of the firm or the role of businesses. What should businesses do? Is there one particular role of the firm that we can pin down? Should firms profit maximize? If they should profit maximize, is it because they have a duty to do so, or because it leads to good outcomes, or both, or something different? If they shouldn't profit maximize, why shouldn't they profit maximize? We can also ask, for example, can we even arrive at a very kind of general verdict on what businesses ought to do as such? There's also the view, by the way, in Catholic social thought that the firm is really a community of members. It's a set of individuals. So Elijah, you and I and others get together. We're going to make a product. We think the product's going to improve society. We want to provide for ourselves. We're going to provide for all of the employees. We're a community. So what we do is we make the product. The key thing to do is to make a product we believe in that will actually serve the common good. And then also, if we make money in the process, that's fine. Indeed, that's a good thing if it helps us and if we're using it in a wise way.
Interesting. So I think it's important that we separate good and bad in terms of like what is effective at reaching a goal versus like what is morally good, like what should you do on a moral level. So you kind of laid out a lot of ideas as to what businesses should do. Should they profit maximize? Should they look for other options? And then why should they do that? On the moral grounds, I'm interested in what your beliefs are, or maybe what your area of study has led you to believe. To answer this question, I guess if you were to try to come up with a definition of what businesses should do, what have you kind of been playing with or landed on?
Well, my colleagues here in the visiting position at Notre Dame have done some important work. So Jim Otteson, for example, has written a book called Honorable Business. Mary Hirschfeld has written a book called Aquinas in the Market. And a lot of the ideas, really the kind of the central argumentation in those books and many others, revolves around this idea that business exchanges are win-win or positive sum. So, for example, you go on Amazon. Okay, you get on Amazon, you're going to buy something. You're thinking, well, what do I buy? What should I get? Say you're buying a shirt or something. You're just thinking, all right, I'll buy a shirt. What kind of shirt? You pick out something. Maybe it costs $40. All right, but say you're willing to pay $50 for it. Well, if you buy it for $40, but you're willing to pay $50, then you gain $10 in value. That's your consumer surplus. So you win in that case. In a sense, you win, but the firm wins too. So the firm selling on Amazon, where Amazon is the intermediary, providing the platform, the firm might be willing to sell for as low as $32, but the firm sells for $40. The firm wins too then. They get the equivalent of $8 of value. That's the producer surplus. You add those together, you get a win-win exchange, and that's $18 of value. Now, the interesting thing is, Elijah, if you do this over and over, 1,000 times a second, maybe around the world, maybe more often than that, you get all sorts of win-win exchanges. And so you might think, to your question, that really a crucial role for business and society is to engage in and make possible win-win exchanges, positive sum human activity. We all cooperate, we benefit. Now, this might seem like a sort of a rosy picture because there are lots of bad things that some businesses do. There are also negative externalities, as economists call them. So a business pollutes, for example, and it harms third parties. There are some bad things, to be sure. But one important thing is if you think of businesses involved in win-win exchange, that can help to explain the massive increase in GDP per capita. So would you like me to say a bit about that? There's the kind of the change in wealth over the last couple of centuries.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so from around 1800 until now, GDP per capita. So the overall amount of stuff produced in an economy per person, so just the average per person, this has increased dramatically. So the increase, economists predict, has been something on the order of 15 to 30 fold. So not 15% or 150% from 1800 until now, but something like 1500% at the least, up to maybe 3000. Now, this is a massive increase. And you might ask, like, okay, we're talking about ethics. We're talking about lives well lived. Why does this matter? Well, it matters because billions of people have been pulled out of poverty. So a central consideration in business is how to contribute to good societies. And certainly one way, a paradigmatic way in which businesses do that is that they help people go from being poor to being wealthier. And where wealth, by the way, is not just like having extra money as disposable income, but having things like potable water, having the stunning capacity to control the temperature in any given room, having this capacity to flip on a switch and have the lights turn on, being able to fly across, within the USA and from country to country in a metal box at 500 miles an hour and trusting that it'll go well and being rational in one's trust. So in this way, businesses really enable win-win exchange, and they've transformed human civilization really as we know it, especially the last couple of centuries.
Yeah, I mean, this is super interesting. I wonder, when you're talking about win-win exchange and you're talking about the businesses that do a good job of this, how would you qualify like the percentage or the amount of businesses that aren't engaging in win-win, that maybe they are overpricing material that needs to be paid for, something that like a necessity and it's overpriced, but there's not really an option to pay less. Or maybe you have to deal with the ignorance of the public who hasn't really put a lot of thought into how much they would value the services that they'd buy. And if they had, they would value it less. So like situations like this, how do you kind of account for, or how would you describe the differences between situations that are win-win and situations that maybe aren't as much?
Well, definitionally, situations that aren't win-win will involve at least one party losing in an exchange, and this certainly happens. It could be because uh, any side of an exchange could be underinformed or could be acting irrationally, for example, or with ill will. There can be fraud or deception. But something really important here that the Nobel laureate Friedrich Hayek, famous philosopher and economist, says is that it's really interesting, isn't it, that when we go to buy something, our focus really increases. At the point of exchange, we really are incentivized to think about what would be best for us. Especially if we're buying something and it's costly. You want to buy a new car, pay, I don't know, $25,000, maybe more. You're incentivized to think, is this really good for me? And you think of lots of different considerations, and you think about things particular to you, by the way. So about your particular life, your life story, your own beliefs, your interests, your desires, what you'd use the car for, what kind of style you'd like in a car, what kind of engine you'd like, how often you'd drive it, how much you care about gas mileage, and on and on and on. Probably dozens of different considerations. And so in an interesting way, market exchange often has the effect of really getting exchangers to focus and to pay attention to what matters to them. And in that way, I think it's fair to say that at least very many exchanges are win-win exchanges. But again, there's the flip side of the coin, and we can talk about that, which I mentioned. So the lack of information in some cases, the lack of scruples that some business people have, the lack of rationality in some cases.
Yeah, and I think those are interesting. And I agree with the premise so far. I think that my role is to provide the criticisms or to provide the ideas that people are probably instinctively jumping to when they hear a description like this of business. And so some of the ones that I was thinking of is that, and I don't know if this is necessarily conspiracy, but there's an idea or a perception that advertisement is very intentional in tricking you into believing that things should cost more or are more valuable than they actually are, and that this is a process that lasts and starts from a very young age. and that societally we are told to appreciate these things. We are told to value money. We are told to value these things, although maybe in a different society, or if we were not told to value these things, we might make different value judgments. Therefore, we might not ever have super accurate judgments as to what we need. I guess what is your response to that idea or that criticism?
So every time we speak with others, they're probably trying to convince us of something, trying to persuade us of something. They often, almost always, believe in what they say, and they think that their views, as I do, that their views are at least plausible. It's certainly the case in advertising. So that there are, and this can go to extremes, just to emphasize that. So advertisers are making arguments. They're saying, look, here you are in the marketplace. You're a potential customer. Here's the strongest possible argument we can make to appeal to you. And then ideally, it's on you to decide whether the argument holds. So the economist question is always compared to what? And so our task as consumers is to think, well, if advertiser A says to buy that product and B says to buy a different product, and another option is not to buy any product, what should we do? Now, there are many cases, as you rightly point out, in which advertisers go too far. So using psychological tactics, or think of the design of different web platforms, for example, like social media. There are attention engineers where basically people go in on social media for the dopamine spike very often, and it can be difficult to avoid social media, or to avoid looking online at news and so on, because there's so much addictive material with flashy headlines where, look, there's a war here, there's there, we should be deeply concerned, and quite so, of course. But it really is a challenge for any adult to think about how much time they should allocate to perusing advertisements and whether they should buy different consumer goods. And there are cases like that. There are also cases, by the way, unrelated to advertising. The famous Ford Pinto case, for example, where companies make decisions with very questionable trade-offs. So Ford Pinto decided to mount a fuel tank in the rear of the car, and for $11 more, they could have improved it and made it less dangerous, but they made a purely economic calculation and decided to keep the fuel tanks there because they thought that basically the cost and deaths from more car accidents and suffering was outweighed by the economic gains that they thought they would benefit from. And so there are lots of very concerning business practices. But to say that, by the way, is not at all to say that typically business is good. I mean, it's not at all to deny that. It's to insist that typically exchanges are positive sum. And it's difficult, I'll just add one more thing. It's difficult in a world of over 300 million firms to get something like a representative sample of business exchanges. I would expect in such a world to see many, many different stories, many of them true, of businesses acting in egregious ways, in morally aberrant ways. And so that's no surprise. A big question, though, is can we really generalize on the basis of a set of a few or a dozen or just dozens of cases, severe as they might be, to sustain a claim that business itself is inherently bad or businesses tend not to be positive sum and so on. I don't think we can.
Right. Okay. So you would qualify a lot of the criticisms as being valid, but not saying enough to the broader whole to get rid of business, or at least to say that like business is net bad. And so what kind of gives you the comfort to not assess that it's bad? Because I feel as if when a lot of people are talking about these things, they would bring it to the general structure that, like, yes, you do have this moral obligation to create good, double successful interactions. But at the same time, you could also push that to kind of what you were talking about earlier, which is maximize the profit, which is maybe an underlying business incentive that can undercut this desire to make sure that everything is beneficial to both parties. So how do you kind of balance the incentive of profit maximizing versus also giving people the best deal?
So on what's called stakeholder theory, the thought is that yes, businesses should make a fair bit of money. They should not necessarily profit maximize, but it's fine if they make profits. Indeed, the profit signal is an important signal indicating the success of a business. Are they meeting needs in the marketplace? Are they giving consumers items, providing items that add value to people's lives? So profit really is an important signal. It's not a decisive signal, but it's an important signal. One thing I would add is, look, think about all the items that we rely on from businesses. Think about the computers we have, think about the clothes we have, think about the cars we have, homes, and on and on and on. And then try to think in your mind, just in your mind's eye, come up with a list of all of these different items and think about how many of them are very bad things, or how many of them aren't good for us, how many of them have really set our interests back versus facilitating our interests versus advancing our interests. Pro-business scholars, even if they're qualified in their endorsement, will say, on average, the things we choose to buy from firms are good for us. On average, they improve our lives. Otherwise, we wouldn't buy them. Typically, now we make mistakes, of course, and sometimes we're duped by deceitful advertisers, for example, or sometimes we really think we want to buy the fancy car, and then we waste a bunch of money, and it doesn't make our life happy as we would hope it would, and so on, right? But overall, the things we rely on from businesses are very important in the life well lived. And so I would say overall, business, it's fair to say is good.
Okay, yeah, and I definitely think I agree with this on its face. I do think that this extrapolates into a broader discussion of capitalism versus socialism or communism, in that how we decide what these incentive structures is kind of important. And it seems as if a very kind of positive outlook on business would be more in alignment with capitalism. But I guess how do you weigh the structures? And then I guess what are your opinions on this conversation of capitalism versus socialism or communism?
So capitalism is a term that was actually coined by the critics of so-called capitalism. It's a very loaded term. Gerald Gauss, a philosopher who was one of my teachers at the University of Arizona, says, look, we want to define our terms. So what is capitalism? Well, capitalism really is a system of markets and then hierarchical firms. That's what it is. It's a decentralized system of profit-oriented production and exchange, in which you have firms that basically they take resources out of an economy, they transform the resources. They're kind of like islands within an economy, and they put the resources back into the economy in the hope that they'll make money, and in doing so, or along the way, hopefully improve people's lives. And so capitalism is that decentralized system of exchange. It relies heavily on the price system, where prices are signals. So if you go to the store, you see something for $3, you normally buy it, but actually it goes up to $10, something like that. You don't need to know why. You don't need to know whether there's a supply chain disruption or shock, states or countries away. You just need to look at the price and think, well, maybe I shouldn't buy it, or I better really need it, right? Or maybe I can find an alternative good, a substitute, or maybe I should forego consumption. Okay, very different system from socialism. So socialism is a system of centralized allocation of resources, at least in the paradigmatic case. If you think of kind of the U.S. and the Soviet Union and the bipolar 20th century, where you have these different geopolitical and economic systems. The Soviet Union had a system in which there were central planners, and the central planners were going to bring about justice by more effectively allocating resources. And so there were committees formed and different decisions were made about the use of productive resources. Under socialism, It's public ownership of the means of production, not private ownership. So the government owned factories and farms and decided, for example, how they were to be used. So that's really the distinction between capitalism and socialism. And then there's this big question, like which system is better? Now, if you look at purely in terms of wealth production, there's no debate to be had. There was great marketization in the late 1970s that lifted billions of people out of poverty in China and India when China and India adopted market-oriented reforms. And as I've said, the increase in wealth since around 1800, starting in Europe and spreading throughout the world, has been enormous, and it's not from socialism. But there are big debates to be had about the justice of different systems, and there's a lot more to be said here.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what most people's minds are probably going to gravitate towards when you talk about the effects of business, is that the idea is that when you switch to something more socialist, that you are taking out a lot of the incentives that could lead to corruption, or at least you're tapering a lot of the high ceiling rewards that you can get from being a corrupt business owner. And then also, but from having these incentives that are profit oriented. And so the conception is that socialism will still provide for the people and still be an acceptable form of economy, while also kind of taking out that ceiling, allowing for people to be extremely, I would say, like greedy or profit oriented. So I guess, what is your reaction? And if that is true, how do you kind of weigh the balance between the risks of maybe this high greed capitalist structure that a lot of people will accuse it of being, versus, the economic gain of a capitalist structure? How do you kind of balance those two factors?
Good. So there are different forms of capitalism, and one bad form is crony capitalism, for example. So a bunch of powerful business people go to Washington, D.C., for example, and they engage in extensive lobbying because it's worth their while, and they rig the system, the rules, and they make the rules in their favor. They block competitors from entering the market, and so on. That's a bad form. One big question here is like, well, where do our ideas about business come from? So, as I said, capitalism itself is a loaded term, probably loaded beyond repair. But just think about business. Just think about markets with hierarchically structured firms where there are chains of commands. There's the so-called C-suite with the CEO and the CIO and so on, CFO. Well, a lot of our ideas about businesses come from, say, Hollywood movies, for example. We're socialized to a large extent in thinking that businesses are greedy. We look from an early age. I mean, I can't speak for you or for others' experiences, but you watch, presumably, you watch some movies that have businesses involved in the movies, and the business leaders are greedy and corrupt, and they're not the kinds of people you'd want to have a beer with or what have you, or hang out with. They're not the kinds of people you trust around your family, and on and on. So we want to ask, first of all, is that an idea of business that we need to be disabused of? Is it a mistaken conception that might well sell a lot of movies, for example, but not really be characteristic? Now, there are certainly cases like Bernie Madoff, for example, other recent scandals. There are, Sam Bankman-Fried, and on and on. There are many different cases, as I said earlier, things you'd expect to see in the media when there's so much business that's being done. But we can ask, like, are these business people as they are, or just as they're portrayed generally by non-business people? I don't know. There's a lot to be said. When it comes to socialism, there's a big debate about among philosophers and economists, political scientists, and historians about the epistemic value of socialistic central planning in an economy, and also motivational concerns. So in a market-oriented society, presumably if you have a business, you're going to want to make sure you really steward your resources well. You take good care to make good productive use of your resources. You might well be inclined to use them in ways that are bad for third parties, and that can be a problem, something that regulation can address, public or possibly private. But you'll want to make sure that your business succeeds. Well, what if you're in charge of all of the resources for a society of 340 million people, like the U.S., or say for the world's oldest and largest democracy, India, with 1.4 billion people? Well, you might well have a great heart and want to make sure everyone of whom you've, personally, of whom you personally know, maybe 0.001%, everyone does well. But there's a real motivational question. Are you going to plan in ways that don't systematically favor your friends and disfavor others? Then there's the question briefly of epistemology. So if you're making plans, and again, in the paradigm case of centrally planned socialistic economies, if you're making plans about how to allocate resources, on what basis will you make those plans? It's a difficult question. Think about how we consume when we buy things on Amazon, for example. We think about what's good for us personally. We know ourselves probably better than anybody knows us. And if that's the case, you might ask, well, what would socialistic planners not know about us that they should know if they are to allocate resources efficiently? So these are some things to consider, not decisive considerations necessarily, but I think they're weighty considerations. And when you hear of cases like in the Soviet Union, when the planners had groups make shoes that ended up being less valuable than the sum of their parts, you can see how planning really can go awry.
Yeah, this is super interesting. There are certain criticisms of both capitalism and socialism that I find to be interesting. And I guess it could be answered by the question of, would you consider, if there were a kind of a scale of the most capitalist society and the most socialist society, would you consider moving kind of towards socialism but still maintaining a capitalist idea? Because I think a lot of people, when they're discussing this, they'll talk about going full blown 100% socialism, and then they'll arise these questions of how would you do it? How would this work? And it automatically gets shut down. When the real questions about, I guess, a socialist idea are like, hey, some people are uber rich, some people are uber poor. Is there a way we can kind of middle that just a little bit while maintaining the incentive structures that we have? Sort of an idea like that. Like, are there socialist ideas that we can kind of implement while still maintaining a capitalist idea? And then would you agree with those if we were to maybe agree to maintain a capitalist structure, but add some of these socialist ideas of maybe trying to moderate the wealth a little bit, maybe trying to do these things? How do you feel about that?
Well, a big question is who's the we, right? And we always, use the term as shorthand or very often, and there's frequently an unspecified we. So think of Max Weber's definition of the state. So Max Weber, the famous sociologist, thought of the state as that entity which claims a territorial monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. So the state for Weber, and George Washington, by the way, says this, that the government is, it's not eloquence, really, it's force in a sense. And that great philosopher, George Washington, but certainly had many good insights, was a great leader in many respects. But going back to Weber, so you might think, okay, well, who's the we? And then you think, all right, well, maybe the we is the state, the entity which claims legitimate power to make laws, interpret laws, execute laws, and enforce laws. Okay, fair enough, you might think. And then the question becomes, well, what would it look like in practice for that state to arrange political economic life in a way that in a better way than now? And you're quite right to point out that really the menu of options is enormous. So we're often presented with a false choice. Like, are you for this extreme view or that extreme view? There are no middle options. But if you think about human societies are the most complex entities perhaps in the known universe. Okay, so you have physical systems that are extremely complex. I mean, interestingly, by the way, there's dark matter and dark energy that constitute 95% of the physical universe, and especially physicists, let's say, to focus on their judgments on this matter. They don't quite know what it is, to put it mildly, and many say they don't have a clue, really. So all right, well, physical systems are enormous and complex. Financial markets are extremely complex. Well, human societies might well be even more complex, partly because they include financial systems, for example. And so we can ask, like, is it better to have socialism or capitalism? And then are there options in the middle? So democratic socialism, for example, would be one option in the middle. Or instead of, say, a full-on market system with a minimal or no government, you could have a strong welfare state, for example, and that could be capitalistic. So like many of the social democracies today, for example, we think of them as socialistic, and they are in some respects, but they also have things like high corporate tax rates. They also have school voucher systems. They have markets that they rely upon and that generate wealth, and then they redistribute the wealth created by markets. So in many ways, they're actually capitalistic. But it's a really good question. Like, where along a spectrum could one, or where along a spectrum is the best political economic system, all things considered? And that's really difficult because, I mean, look, there's no single dimension along which all value varies. It's not like you can just, at least in my view, it's not like you can just add up utility, for example, and say, this version of socialism gets 100 utility points. This one has 105 utils. This version of capitalism has 108, and let's just find the best one and then go with that. There are too many considerations, and in fact, it can be misleading even to think that there's a single political spectrum along which all things that matter vary. The human societies are more complex than that.
Yeah, and that's probably true. I think as a young person, it's difficult to hear that the the question can't have just like a simple answer. And I think that's an insightful thing to learn when you're having any conversation about something like this, just such a big system interworking with so many people. I think that the incentive structure of business is just too important to miss out on. But I did hear from somebody that the incentive of money is always bad and is always they had said that the incentive of money is always bad and it's always kind of vapid and empty, and that if you could still maintain an incentive structure but without the monetary incentive, that would be a better society. So I guess in terms of what you should be incentivized by, how do you feel about the accusation that money is just like a really terrible incentive?
I wouldn't say it's terrible, although I would say it certainly can be terrible. It certainly has driven people to do terrible things. Now, you think, okay, so what have firms done, and how does that compare to what governments have done, for example? Well, any system really is only as good as its people, but there are like structural differences. So think of the book came out from Harvard University Press called the Black Book of Communism, and it details the 100 million plus deaths under socialism in the 20th century. Have there been deaths under capitalism? Yes, for sure. But you might ask, like, well, compared to what? So what are the alternatives that we face here? You might think, well, that was 20th century socialism, and we're far ahead of that. We're now in 2024. Maybe there's a 21st century socialism that can do much better. Well, if so, there's a strong burden of argument. So the burden is to show how the new system would be different in kind, and produce much better results and treat people better, most importantly, than the older system. That's the argumentative burden.
Yeah, and I think it's a powerful burden. It's hard to face that though when you were kind of talking about the media and our perspective earlier. I think that the perspective of business owners, the perspective of capitalism can be tuned to be so evil that when you're faced with that problem, it's kind of annoying to hear like, okay, well, you're gonna have to like, if you want to do that, you're gonna have to do all this work to discover the most perfect system. And it's a completely valid request, and probably a necessary request for people to have. But I think as people who are listening to this and they're very upset with the way that they perceive the system, how do you kind of alleviate the pain that they're feeling that like, look, you mean well, but the work that you're going to have to do is just beyond anything that anybody's ever done. Like, how do you kind of alleviate that or kind of direct people to see that that's really the thing that they're upset at?
Yeah, well, the pain people feel is real. People have suffered under different political economic systems and sometimes severely. I mean, it's not just the 20th century socialistic systems where people were sent to camps and societies were radically reorganized and so on. People lose their jobs, they can't find jobs. There are lots of different ways in which economic systems don't perform as people would like. So really, here you enter into the field known as political economy. And in political economy, there's the question, how should resources be allocated? What rights do people have, and how can those rights be best respected? What duties do people have? How can people be virtuous within a political economic system? So I mentioned the idea from Catholic social thought that really, if we're going to start a firm, what we should do is make a product that we believe in, and then interact in ways that really bring out our moral and intellectual excellences as human beings. And yes, we should provide for our community, our employees, and to do that, we need to make profit. But profit itself isn't the main goal. It's not the ultimate goal or the main goal of business, and it shouldn't be. But that's not to say don't make a business that's viable, right? It's if someone has a business, it should be viable. Now, I say this kind of from the interesting position of being a philosopher in a society that has only fairly recently in world history been able to afford to pay people to read and write and think. My grandparents were not in the position, and my great grandparents and on weren't in the position of being able to really have the privilege of being in academia and reading and writing and thinking. And so we might ask, well, that seems like a pretty good situation to have a society where many people can engage in activities that aren't purely like very demanding physical labor. But that's not at all to say that there aren't a whole lot of jobs that are very bad jobs. I'm working on articles related to this, by the way, on the kind of the dignity of labor and ways in which employees aren't treated well. It's a big problem. And it wasn't only a problem for Adam Smith when he, Smith, the famous philosopher and political economist, when he was talking about the pin factory and the monotonous labor that people were doing as the Industrial Revolution was starting to kind of take root. Smith worried about people working in a pin factory doing one task, two tasks all day long, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. That sort of labor is that is very, very difficult. It's difficult, and it can be demeaning and degrading. And in any case, there are real concerns about labor, and it's we don't have pin factories so much, say, in many of the so-called advanced or developed economies where the labor is like that. But we have many things like that. And Amazon, for example, has at times had concerning working conditions, and many large firms have. So those concerns are real. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that when you're balancing the conversation around what is ethical, what is good around business, it's difficult to properly view the scale of these things, and that these things are serious issues and that they do exist. But then you have to ask yourself at what scale. And I think you've done a really good job of grounding this against all the positive business interactions that we might not be focusing on because they're not as attractive as the terrible business reaction or actions, or they're not as loud or present as the terrible business actions. And I think you've done a good job of grounding that in reality and grounding that into how many good business interactions that we have. But we are running out of time for this episode, but I wanted to give you a final opportunity to kind of wrap this up and to kind of, as an overarching theme, maybe readdress some of the points that we had talked about, or an overarching message about the discussion of business ethics that you think that viewers should walk away with. But the floor is kind of yours to wrap us out.
All right, great. Well, thank you again for having me. I really appreciated this. And so we've talked about business being positive sum, at least in many cases, not always, but in many cases. Any student or anyone listening to this should keep in mind that these are really difficult questions, that if we're talking about whole systems of political economy, It's really hard to arrive at very nuanced, detailed views of the particular systems in question. So that can take a lifetime of study. It's not easy, but it matters greatly, as we all know. One thing I will say here towards the end of our discussion is that in Catholic social thought, an area in which I work, there's really a focus on what business should do in terms of lives well lived. Okay, so think of C.S. Lewis's famous argument from the book Mere Christianity, where he says, okay, this guy named Jesus comes to Earth. Okay, he's living on Earth. He makes this remarkable, wild claim. He says, I am, or I am who I am. And everybody really knows then exactly what he's claiming. He's put to death for that claim because they know he's claiming that he is God incarnate. Okay, and in the perspective of Catholic social thought, Christ was different in kind from all other human beings. He was God-man, really. And so Lewis says, look, you've got three options there. You can say he was who he claimed he was. So he was the Lord. You can say he just made it up. He was out there. You can read the Gospels and say this guy's just a big liar. He's making it up. So he's not the Lord, but he's a liar. Or you can say he was crazy. He was deranged, etc. You can say he was a lunatic. So those are the three options as Lewis sees it: Lord, liar, or lunatic. And so if you end up thinking that, well, Christ didn't seem to be a lunatic, and you think, well, he wasn't lying. We don't have evidence of that. Then you're left, Lewis thinks, as he argues in Mere Christianity, to think that Christ was the Lord. If that's the case, then you might ask, like, okay, that totally changes everything. That's a game changer. What should a business do? What should any human being do in their lifetime? Well, it's not the case that our ultimate purpose is to make profit, right? It's not like if you do the obituary test, the thing you want to have on your tombstone is this person maximized the difference between total revenue and total cost, right? So that's not what we're here for in the tradition of Catholic social thought and Christianity more generally, and I would say really theism more generally, especially monotheism, I would say. What we're here for is to grow in union with God. If you buy that, and all arguments are bundles of costs and benefits in a way. There are pluses and minuses around all positions. But if you think with many, many others, with Aquinas, with Leibniz, with Newton, with the people who started and many who continue science, who think that the world is fundamentally intelligible because it came from an intelligence. If you think that, for example, it's remarkable that, as Lord Rees says, there are 6 mathematical constants in the world behind physics, and if any one of which, if it were changed by a trillionth of a decimal place, we wouldn't be here to talk about it. The universe wouldn't exist. If you think any of that's interesting, or if you think really the call to live, a life of love for God is interesting, and you find it plausible, then you're going to think that the purpose of business and the purpose of societies and political economic systems within them, that's all going to be deeply affected. That really it's a call to really grow in union with God and to have different systems in place and practices that support that.
Yeah, I think that that's really insightful, and I love that a lot of this has been prescribed into a really applicable worldview, that we're not just talking about abstract economics. We're talking about what you should do. We're talking about how you should feel. And I think that this has been a really wonderful conversation. And I thank you so much for coming on here, Greg.
My pleasure, Elijah. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.